and Japan, as well as the 20th century communist bloc that included everywhere from Poland to Kazakhstan to Cuba to Vietnam. It's not much of a stretch to say that dictatorship, in whatever form, was the single greatest cause of preventable human suffering and death in the last century. So anyway, as you can see, the sins of imperialism and dictatorship alone are probably common enough to implicate like 90% of the modern world, which makes the O'Toole thesis about how every country has a shameful past pretty close to being universally true. But now, let us look at a couple of countries that are not so easily classified. There is a popular stereotype that the nations of Scandinavia are a uniquely sinless part of the world. The almost nearly perfect people, as one author playfully described them. But the people who actually live in these places are usually a little bit more clear-eyed about themselves, including the upsetting but often not well-known chapters of their history. So here is a trick. If you ever want to find an easy way to figure out what a country is ashamed of, just look up what their leaders have issued an official apology for. The governments of Sweden, Norway, and Finland, for instance, have all in recent years issued apologies of various sorts for their historic mistreatment of the northern-dwelling Sami people. The Sami are often described as the only indigenous peoples in Europe, and much like the indigenous peoples of the New World, were subject to displacement from their traditional lands and heavy-handed and often highly physically and emotionally abusive assimilation initiatives that continued well into the 20th century and some say amounted to cultural genocide. All of the Scandinavian countries likewise have shames related to the Second World War in some way. Norway had a viciously pro-Nazi government that exported hundreds of Jews to death camps. The Finns had a military alliance with the Nazis as part of an anti-Russian alliance and have thus been implicated in some Nazi war crimes. And while Sweden stayed neutral in the year 2000, the Swedish government admitted that in retrospect, staying neutral in a war between fascism and democracy was morally wrong. The government of Switzerland, which is another place I think many people think of as being stereotypically innocent, has also apologized on multiple occasions for the degree that its wartime neutrality allowed it to engage in morally abhorrent activities, including the laundering of Nazi gold and the turning away of over 25,000 Jewish refugees. The tiny nation of Iceland similarly deported most of its Jews during the war and refused to accept Jewish refugees as well. The same was true of other tiny European countries like Luxembourg and Liechtenstein. Which basically gets us to one of the other most common themes of historic shames: violent hatred or cruel indifference to people within your own borders. If a country wasn't a dictatorship or an imperial power, chances are high it at least went through some modern phase of internal violence against itself. Ireland, for instance, had a civil war in the early 20th century that began as a war of independence from Great Britain, but soon evolved into a war pitting Irishmen against Irishmen, which then continued until the 1990s in the north. India went through a similar situation following its independence from Britain in 1947, which saw terrible violence between Hindus, Sikhs, and Muslims as part of the partition project to cleanly divide the new Muslim state of Pakistan from predominantly Hindu India. Now, many Indians and Irish would doubtless argue that none of this violence would have occurred if not for the ways that the British mismanaged their colonial societies. But still, there does come a point at which the guilt of those who directly committed the killings starts to overshadow that of those who merely created the context. In any case, both of these countries' governments do often make a show of feeling shame and remorse about these unquestionably grim periods of their history. Okay, now having worked through these special cases, let me now tell you what part of the world I think might be able to make the strongest claim about having a relatively shameless history, even though the argument is kind of complicated. But before that, let us now hear a word from the sponsor of today's video, Ground News. So as you know, we are living in a time in which there is a truly epic abundance of news. News everywhere, and news coming at you from more publications, networks, and websites than ever before in the history of man. So if you're trying to navigate this brave new world without some sort of news aggregator app, I don't know what you're doing. May I suggest today's video sponsor, Ground News. Ground News provides you with a comprehensive, well-organized news-consuming experience, bringing you headlines and links on subjects you're interested in from over 50,000 outlets from around the world and across the political spectrum. But what really makes them stand out is this little thing at the bottom that tells you the degree to which a story is playing more in the center-right press press or the center-left press? So for example, a story that they've noted the progressive press has been ignoring is this one about Elon Musk coming out in favor of nuclear power, while a story the conservative press has been ignoring is this one about the accelerating rate of deforestation in the Amazon. Anyway, as someone who has used a lot of news aggregator apps in my day, I can honestly say that this is one of the best in terms of the features and customization options. I even have the widget installed on my phone, and I've recently started visiting their very slick website as well. If you want to give this very cool and very free app a try, just visit ground.news/JJ or click the link on the thing below and get started today. Ground News. Be informed, clearly. All right, so my pick for the countries with the least controversial history is the English-speaking Caribbean. Now, on the one hand, the Anglo-Caribbean countries are very obviously products of a horrible history of colonization and indigenous displacement and genocide, just as the rest of the New World is. In fact, the removal of the indigenous population of the so-called West Indies is probably among the most bleakly successful of any such effort in history, given how astronomically low the surviving indigenous population of these places is today. Thoroughly deprived of their original inhabitants, during the 17th and 18th centuries, the islands of the English Caribbean were transformed into equally extreme examples of slave colonies, whose character became almost entirely defined by an extremely zealous import and use of African slave labor, which is why these countries all have black majority populations to this day. So yeah, there is clearly a lot of depressing stuff in the history of the Anglo-Caribbean, but because these countries are now mostly run by the descendants of the slaves and not the colonizers, the lines of historic responsibility are kind of blurred in a unique way. It would be strange for the government of, say, Barbados to feel shame about the slave trade, for instance, when basically every senior person in their government, from the president on down, is themselves a descendant of slaves. Instead, these places usually argue that most of their country's historic shames are really just the shames of Europe, and something that Europe should be more remorseful about. As the victims, their conscience is clear. The Anglo-Caribbean countries also have no record of dictatorship, which is something that distinguishes them from the other countries of the Caribbean, like Cuba and Haiti and the Dominican Republic, which very much did. Since gaining independence from Great Britain in the 1960s, tiny Grenada is the only English Caribbean country to have ever seen a democratically elected government overthrown, and even then, only briefly. All the others have a perfect record of peaceful transfers of power. But surely these places must have something in their post-independence past that they feel bad about. So I did the old trick of looking up their official apologies. In 2017, the Prime Minister of Jamaica officially apologized for something he described as a chapter in our national life that was characterized by brutality, injustice, and repression. He was referring to the mistreatment of the Rastafarians, who, as you may know, are an eccentric religious sect in that part of the world. Their beliefs and practices, including their famous pot use, always made them unpopular with Jamaica's Christian majority, and even post-independence, Rasta people were often on the receiving end of discrimination, harassment, and even violence by state authorities who stereotyped them as criminals and troublemakers. The 1960s was a period of particular tension and violence between Rastas and state authorities, and that was the dark chapter that the Prime Minister was specifically apologizing for. There are Rasta communities in other Anglo-Caribbean countries as well who have faced similar mistreatment, and in recent years the governments of those countries have issued official apologies to them too. Likewise, some English Caribbean countries have significant minority populations of Asian, Indian, Arab, white, and mixed race peoples, and there has occasionally been tension between these groups and the black majority, as well as tensions born from divisions of color and culture, and especially sexual diversity within the black community itself. But by the standards of much of the world, these tensions have been incredibly mild, and I don't think that these places are necessarily wrong to be proud about this fact. Which in turn begs one of the most controversial questions about this whole shameful history issue. Even if we accept that all countries have some shames in their past, is it possible to rank some shames as being objectively worse than others? Is Germany's Nazi history worse than the history of Mao Zedong's rule in China? Is Mao Zedong's rule worse than Brazilian slavery? Is the discrimination faced by the Jews of Iceland as bad as that of the Rastafarians in Antigua? And how far back are you supposed to go when assessing history? The Greek dictatorship of the 1970s might not be as bad in terms of body count as the Chilean dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet, but Alexander the Great was unquestionably worse than him.